There is a statue buried under a cathedral, not near it, under it. In 1711, workmen digging beneath the choir of Notre-Dame de Paris hit stone that wasn't part of the church at all. A broken pillar, carved centuries before the cathedral existed, dedicated by a guild of riverboatmen to a set of gods. Most of those gods were the ones you'd expect under a Roman-era monument: Jupiter, thunder in hand; Vulcan at his forge; Castor and Pollux, twin riders; and then, carved into the same stone, given the same weight, labelled with the same care, a bearded man with the antlers of a stag talks hanging from each horn like they'd been hung there as offerings. His name was carved beside him: Cernunnos, the only Celtic god in the entire find who got that honour, a name spelled out so there could be no mistake about who he was. And then, for most of the next 2,000 years, almost nobody wrote another word about him. No myths survive, no epic, no priest's account of how he was worshipped, or what his followers believed happened when they died. Just the image, carved and cast and hammered into metal, again and again, across a landscape of forests and rivers that doesn't exist anymore. And then, centuries later, a face very much like his, staring out from under a different name. Horns, a beard, a serpent at his feet. Only now they call him the Devil, and not as a passing insult either. Of every horned figure this channel could have picked, this is the one whose downward push landed hardest. Most demoted gods end up small, cute even. A garden ornament, a Christmas mascot, a children's book illustration. This one ended up as the single most feared image an entire civilization spent 1,000 years building. This is the story of how a god without a myth got the most successful afterlife in European religious history, demoted not into a fairy tale, not into a shrunken folk figure, but into the single most feared image Christianity ever produced, and how, in the last century, he clawed part of himself back. Start with what's actually known, because it's less than you'd think. Cernunnos wasn't originally a Roman god or a British one. He belonged to Gaul, the Celtic-speaking world that covered what's now France, parts of Belgium, western Germany, northern Italy, in the centuries before Rome absorbed it. His name, as best scholars can reconstruct it, simply means the Horned One, or the Antlered One. Cern, the root, shows up across Indo-European languages wherever people needed a word for horn. It's sitting inside the Greek root for unicorn, inside a string of Latin names for antlered animals. It's not a personal name in the way Zeus or Odin are personal names. It's closer to a title, a description that became the only handle history had left to hold him by. The oldest image that might be him is carved into rock in Val Camoneca, in the Italian Alps, dating as far back as the 4th century BCE. An antlered figure, arms raised, a torque-like object beside him. From there the image spreads, not the name, necessarily. The name is only confirmed once on that Paris pillar, but the shape. A seated man, legs crossed beneath him in a pose that has no clear parallel elsewhere in Celtic art. Antlers branching from his head. Often a torque looped around each horn or clutched in one hand, often surrounded by animals. A stag mirroring his own horns, a bull, and, most persistently, a ram-headed serpent coiled at his side or held in his fist. 25 depictions of this figure, or something very like him, have turned up across the old Celtic world. Most cluster in northeastern Gaul, but the type travels, as far as Denmark, on the silver panels of the Gunda Stroop cauldron, where an antlered man sits cross-legged among wolves and stags, holding that same ram-horned serpent, surrounded by a procession of warriors and what might be a ritual drowning. As far as Italy, as far, tentatively, as later medieval art, where scholars have half recognised his outline in the crossed legs and horns of otherwise unrelated figures. What he actually meant to the people who made him is genuinely uncertain, and that uncertainty is worth sitting with instead of rushing past. No Gaulish priest left a written theology. No Roman visitor bothered to record what the locals said he governed. Everything past this point is interpretation built from the evidence of stone and silver, what he's shown. Doing, what he's shown next to, what got buried with his image and what didn't. It's not nothing. It's also not a myth, in the way the word usually means a story with a beginning and an end. It's an outline, and the shape of the outline is the entire inheritance. Cernunnos shows up flanked by wild animals more consistently than almost any other figure in the Celtic material. Stags above all, but also bulls, rats, and that recurring ram-horned serpent, an animal that doesn't exist in nature and seems to have been invented specifically to sit at his feet. Modern scholarship reads this as a god concerned with the wild, not ruling it from outside, the way a hunter god might, but positioned inside it, antlered like the animals he sits among, barely distinguishable from them at a glance. A mediator, some argue, the seam where the human world and the animal one meet, holding both without fully belonging to either. That talk matters too. In the Celtic world, the talk wasn't decoration. It was a marker of status, sometimes of divinity, wrapped around the necks of warriors and gods alike. Cernunnos is shown wearing one, holding one, sometimes with talks hung from his antlers like something between a crown and an offering left by a worshipper. He's rich. He's high status. Whatever forest he belongs to, he doesn't belong to it as a beggar. And there's a colder reading available in the same evidence. One modern neo-pagan writers reach for constantly, and one honest scholarship treats with real caution Cernunnos as a god of the underworld, or of death and its reversal. Some of his imagery has been connected to fertility and renewal. The antlers themselves, after all, are the one part of a stag's body that dies and regrows every single year, discarded each winter and grown back larger each spring, a literal visible resurrection happening on the animal's own skull. Whether the Gauls read that as deliberately symbolic is something no surviving text confirms. But the coincidence is hard to ignore, and it's exactly the kind of pattern later interpreters, right through to today, have built entire theologies on top of. What's fair to say, without overclaiming, Cernunnos occupied a position other gods in the Celtic world didn't quite occupy. Not the sky, not the sea, not the hall of the warband, the place where the forest starts, where the domesticated stops being domesticated, where a hunter's understanding of an animal shades into something closer to kinship. A threshold god standing at the edge of categories other gods didn't need to stand at the edge of. There's a curious postscript to that mediator role worth pausing on, because it resurfaces later. Across the Channel, in England, medieval and early modern folklore preserves a figure called Herne the Hunter, a horned, antlered spirit said to haunt Windsor Forest, sometimes cast as a former royal keeper who hanged himself from an oak after disgrace, sometimes given no backstory at all beyond the horns and the hunt. No documented Celtic evidence connects Herne directly to Cernunnos. Scholars are careful to flag him as a separate, much later English tradition, not a straight descendant. But the shape recurs anyway, antlered, forest-bound, walking the boundary between the human hunting party and the wild thing being hunted. And centuries later, when writers and occultists went looking for a native British face to put on a horned god archetype, Herne was sitting right there, waiting to be folded into the same lineage whether the folklore actually supported it or not. He held that position, largely undisturbed, through the Roman conquest of Gaul. That's worth noting on its own. Rome was not shy about absorbing local gods into its own pantheon, matching a native deity to the nearest Roman equivalent and letting the two blur together. It happened constantly. It didn't really happen to Cernunnos. He kept his own name, his own image, his own altars, sitting alongside Jupiter and Mercury rather than folding into either of them. Whatever he was distinct enough, or important enough locally, that 4 centuries of Roman religious administration left him standing on his own 2, or rather cloven, feet. Then Rome fell. Christianity spread through the same forests he'd once stood at the edge of, and the outline of Cernunnos went quiet for a very long time. When the horns come back into focus, they belong to someone else. Early Christian art didn't invent a devil from nothing. For the first several centuries of the Church, Satan wasn't consistently drawn at all. Depictions vary wildly, sometimes human, sometimes a shadowy abstraction, sometimes barely differentiated from a fallen angel with dark wings and nothing more sinister than that. The image most people now picture automatically the moment someone says, "the devil." Horns, cloven hooves, a beard, sometimes a tail, an unmistakably animal cast to an otherwise human face, assembled itself gradually over centuries out of pieces borrowed from exactly the kind of horned nature gods that had filled the pre-Christian countryside. Cernunnos was never the sole source. The Greek god Pan, goat-legged and horned, fed directly into the same image, arguably more directly than Cernunnos did. But across the specifically Celtic and Gaulish regions, Christianity was converting. The antlered, torque-wearing figure carved into 1,000 local shrines was sitting right there, doing exactly the visual work a new religion needed done. The logic wasn't subtle, and it wasn't unique to Cernunnos. It's the same demotion pattern that ran through every corner of the old pantheon as Christianity moved in. A god of the wild worshipped in forests and standing stones, rather than the church's own buildings, associated with animals rather than divine kingship, syncretized with death and rebirth in ways a new religion focused on a very different resurrection had no use for. That God was an obvious target, not for erasure, which almost never actually works, but for inversion. Keep the horns, keep the animal association, keep the forest. Strip out everything that made him a legitimate object of reverence, and what's left slots almost perfectly into the shape of a tempter, something dangerous, animal and lurking at the tree line, waiting for good Christians to wander too far from the village. This is where the record gets murkier than popular retellings usually admit, and it's worth being honest about that. There is no single church council that stood up and declared, "We are now recasting the horned god as Satan." The transformation is visual and cultural, traced through centuries of art and folk practice, rather than a documented decree, which means historians disagree about exactly how direct the line from Cernunnos, specifically, as opposed to horned nature gods generally, running through to the medieval devil actually is. What's not really in dispute is the broader pattern. Across Celtic Europe, the old wild gods didn't just fade out of belief the way some deities eventually do. They got repurposed as the thing belief was now supposed to fear. It's worth being precise about which horned figure did what work, because popular retellings tend to flatten several distinct gods into one convenient villain. The Greek god Pan, goat-legged, goat-horned, associated with wild places, panic and unrestrained appetite, almost certainly contributed more directly to the devil's specific goat-featured face than Cernunnos did. Pan's iconography was better documented, more widely known across the classical world Christianity was born into, and easier for early theologians to demonize on the record. Cernunnos's contribution is less a single traceable borrowing and more an ambient one. A stag-antlered, forest-dwelling, animal-adjacent god sitting in the cultural water supply of exactly the regions the church was converting, reinforcing the same basic template Pan had already supplied. Two different horned gods from two different pantheons poured into the same demonic mould. Later folk figures like Krampus, the goat-horned punisher of misbehaving children in Alpine Christmas tradition, drew from that same general well of horned equals dangerous, animal and morally suspect, without needing a direct genealogical link back to Cernunnos specifically. The horns became a shared visual shorthand for an entire category of demoted nature spirit, not a single god's unique inheritance. By the medieval period, the image had crystallized into something recognizable at a glance, and in the 19th century it got a second, very deliberate boost from an unexpected direction. In 1856, the French occultist Éliphas Lévi published a drawing he titled The Sabbatic Goat, a horned, half-human, half-animal figure, seated, torch between its antlers, that has become the visual template for nearly every Baphomet image produced since. Lévi wasn't reviving Cernunnos on purpose. He was building a symbol of occult duality, drawing on centuries of accumulated devil iconography that had, whether he knew it or not, absorbed the horned god image generations earlier. But the resemblance to that seated, antlered figure from the Gundu Stroop cauldron and the Valka Onika carvings is hard to unsee once you know what you're looking at. The god who once sat cross-legged holding a ram-horned serpent had, by way of an occultist working 16 centuries later, become the icon modern culture still associates with Satanism. A straight enough line that when a modern statue of Baphomet gets installed on courthouse lawns as a religious liberty protest, the sculpture underneath it is still, structurally, wearing Cernunnos' own silhouette. For most of a millennium and a half, that was the whole afterlife. Demonized, absorbed, forgotten as anything other than raw material for someone else's devil. And then, in the middle of the 20th century, he got claimed back, by people who wanted the demon costume for exactly the reasons the church had put it on him in the first place. The reclamation runs through two names most casual audiences have never heard: Margaret Murray, an Egyptologist turned folklorist, and Gerald Gardner, a retired British civil servant with an interest in the occult. In the 1920s, Murray put forward a theory, now almost entirely rejected by historians, but wildly influential at the time, that the witch trials of early modern Europe hadn't been persecuting an imaginary crime at all. She argued there had been a real, continuous pre-Christian fertility religion surviving underground across the centuries, worshipping a horned god who presided over life, death, and the turning seasons, and that this was the actual religion the witch trials had been trying to stamp out. Murray's history was bad. Later scholarship dismantled it thoroughly. There's no credible evidence of an unbroken underground pagan cult surviving in secret from antiquity through the witch trials. But the theory didn't need to be true to be useful, and in the 1940s and 50s Gerald Gardner built an entire new religion on top of it anyway. That religion was Wicca, and its central male divinity, paired with, and equal to, a triple goddess representing maiden, mother and crone, was the horned god. Not Cernunnos by name, necessarily. Gardner's horned god is a composite drawing on Pan, on Murray's fabricated witch cult deity, on folk custom figures like Herne the Hunter, and yes, on the antlered iconography that had drifted down from Cernunnos through the devil and back out the other side, but the shape is unmistakably the same shape. Antlers. Association with the wild, with the hunt, with the turning of the seasons and the return of the light each winter solstice. A figure understood, within Wicca's Wheel of the Year, not as evil at all, but as the male half of a fertility partnership. Dying each autumn, reborn each spring, exactly the kind of yearly renewal the antlers themselves had always visually promised, 4,000 years before anyone put a Wiccan label on the idea. Gardner didn't work alone for long. Wicca spread through mid-century Britain via students and rivals as much as through Gardner himself, most notably Alex Sanders, who founded his own competing branch in the 1960s and, if anything, leaned harder into the horned god's dramatic, antlered presentation in public ritual, drawing tabloid attention that did more to fix the image in the wider British imagination than Gardner's quieter covens ever had. By the time Wicca crossed the Atlantic and diversified into the broader modern pagan movement, the horned god had become genuinely standardized. Consort to the goddess, ruler of the waning half of the year, invoked at Samhain as death and reborn at Yule as the returning light. A yearly death and rebirth cycle that practitioners will tell you, with real conviction, is the oldest religious idea humanity has, even though the specific ritual package delivering it is barely a century old. It's a genuinely strange loop to trace all the way through. A god demonized specifically because he represented fertility, death, and the wild outside church control gets used 17 centuries later by people building a new religion who wanted exactly that. Fertility, death, and the wild outside church control, and who reached, whether consciously or not, for the same horned silhouette to represent it. The church spent a millennium and a half insisting those horns meant evil. The people who put the horns back on a god in the 20th century largely agreed to keep meaning something else by them anyway, reclaiming the shape more than correcting the record. None of this stayed confined to religious history. It leaked the way these things always leak into the wider culture. And once it did, the demonic version and the reclaimed version started running side by side, mostly without either audience noticing the other. Walk into an occult bookshop, a metal record store or a Halloween costume aisle, and the leviderved Baphomet image, antlers, seated pose, torch, is still doing exactly the work it was drawn to do 170 years ago, signalling danger, transgression, the outsider religion. It's on album covers by the hundred. It's the default evil symbol prop in low-budget horror. It's carved onto the Satanic Temple's own courthouse lawn statue, deployed with full awareness of the provocation. Every one of those images is, at some remove, a great-great-grandchild of a cross-legged god from Gaul, who probably never asked to represent anything sinister at all. Meanwhile, on the other side of the same coin, Wicca and the broader neo-pagan revival kept the horned god as an object of actual devotion, rather than a decoration for spooky merchandise. A figure invoked at solstice rituals paired with the goddess, taught to new practitioners as one half of a balanced cosmology rather than a threat to be warded off. Fiction picked up threads from both directions without much concern for consistency. Horned, antlered nature gods and demon kings show up across fantasy and horror alike, sometimes coded as monstrous, sometimes as tragic and wronged, sometimes, increasingly in recent decades, as explicitly reclaimed folk horror protagonists, a wild god pushing back against a civilization that demonized him first and then forgot why. The specific name has resurfaced too, in ways that would have startled a Gaulish worshipper. Video games set in Viking and Celtic adjacent worlds have used Cernunnos directly as a boss or deity name, usually rendered as a towering antlered figure guarding some threshold the player has to fight or bargain past, the mediator role, unknowingly preserved, now gatekeeping a level transition instead of a forest boundary. Comics and fantasy fiction reach for the same name whenever a story needs a nature god who reads as ancient, morally ambiguous and slightly dangerous, powerful enough to be worth fearing, old enough to predate whatever pantheon the story's heroes actually worship. None of these appearances bother much with the goon dust droop cauldron or the pillar of the boatmen. They don't need to. The antlers alone do the work now, carrying 4,000 years of accumulated meaning into a boss fight or a panel of ink without a single word of explanation required, which is, in its own way, the most successful outcome a forgotten god could ask for. And underneath all of it, quietly, the original image is still exactly where it's always been. The Gundastrup cauldron sits in a museum in Copenhagen. The pillar of the boatmen, the actual stone dug out from beneath Notre-Dame in 1711, is on display at the Musée du Cluny in Paris, a few kilometres from the cathedral it was buried under, Cernunnos' carved face still turned toward whoever walks past. No sermon attached, no warning label, just a bearded man with antlers, talks hanging from his horns, sitting exactly where a Gaulish sculptor left him, centuries before anyone decided what he was supposed to mean. So which one is he in the end? The mediator between forest and farmhouse sitting patiently among his stags and serpent? The face Christianity built its entire idea of temptation on top of? The reclaimed god of a religion invented in the 20th century to give him back a congregation? The album cover shorthand for danger that most of the teenagers buying that album have never once connected to a Roman-era pillar in Paris? All of it, probably, layered, not resolved, the way most of these old gods end up once enough centuries have had a turn with them. That's the pattern this channel keeps finding, video after video, culture after culture. Nothing genuinely disappears. It gets pushed downward, reshaped by whoever needs the shape next, worn as a costume by people who no longer remember whose god it used to be. Sometimes that downward push ends in a Christmas ornament. Sometimes it ends in a children's story. And sometimes, as it did here, it ends somewhere much darker, in the single most feared image an entire religious tradition ever produced, before quietly, unexpectedly, finding its way back out the other side. He's still down there, under the cathedral. He never really left, and neither, in some quieter form, did anyone else this channel has covered. A god without a myth turned out to need one less than every god who had one. All he needed was a face distinctive enough to keep getting borrowed, generation after generation, by whoever needed a horned thing to fear, or to worship, or to sell. Notre-Dame burned in 2019 and was rebuilt on top of the same foundations. Somewhere beneath the new stone, the old one is presumably still there too. A boatman's pillar, a Roman emperor's name carved into its dedication, and a horned god sitting quietly among the Roman pantheon that never quite managed to absorb him, waiting, as he always has, to be found again by whoever digs deep enough to look.